The United States didn't collapse on October 23, 2077. It had been dead for years. The nuclear missiles just made it official. When you think about fallout, you picture the apocalypse, power armor, super mutants, Vault Boy giving that cheerful thumbs up while the world burns. But the real horror story isn't what happened after the bombs fell. It's what America became in the decades before anyone pressed the button. This is the story of how the country that promised liberty and justice for all turned into something unrecognizable, where corporations owned the government, citizens disappeared for thought crimes, and your choice was between starving in the streets or getting incinerated in your vault. By 2077, America had roughly 400 million people living under what looked like democracy, but functioned as corporate dictatorship. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It started in 2052 when the global economy destabilized over petroleum and uranium shortages. Countries that had spent decades building their entire infrastructure around fossil fuels suddenly realized the well was running dry. The result? The resource wars. Nations tearing each other apart over the last drops of oil. Here's where it gets interesting. While the rest of the world descended into chaos, American technology was advancing at breakneck speed. Fusion-powered cars cruising down highways, robots serving drinks at dinner parties. The future everyone in the 1950s dreamed about had finally arrived. Except the culture never evolved past that same era. Women still wore beehive hairdos. Men still came home to their suburban houses with white picket fences. The aesthetic was retrofuturism perfected, but underneath that shiny chrome exterior, something was rotting. The Enclave saw it coming. This wasn't some shadowy organization that emerged after the war. They were already pulling strings decades before the first missile launched. A deep state oligarchy with tentacles reaching into the Senate, the presidency, and every major corporation that mattered. They didn't just influence policy, they were the policy. Senators who asked too many questions had a habit of disappearing under circumstances nobody investigated too closely. Think about that for a second. The continuity of government protocols, the systems designed to keep America functioning during catastrophe, were compromised by the very people meant to protect them. When the bombs finally dropped, there was no command structure left to coordinate any kind of response. The Enclave had transferred everything valuable to their side and abandoned ship. 400 million Americans were left to fend for themselves because their leaders had already retreated to oil rigs and underground bunkers. But let's rewind. How did corporations gain this much power? The answer is simpler than you'd think. When your country is staring down nuclear annihilation, normal business regulations start looking like luxuries you can't afford. Companies like Vault-Tec, West-Tec, and Robco Industries didn't just partner with the Department of Defense, they became the Department of Defense. Vault-Tec launched in 2031 with a straightforward pitch. Nuclear war is coming, and we're building radiation-proof shelters deep underground. For the right price, you could buy your way to safety. Sounds reasonable until you realize the government couldn't fund all the vaults because the resource wars were bleeding the economy dry. So Vault-Tec outsourced funding to other corporations, turning survival itself into a business opportunity. Pay to play, or die with everyone else. Robert House founded Robco Industries on his 22nd birthday in 2042. Despite getting cheated out of his inheritance, he built an empire that rivaled the biggest defense contractors in America. Every Pip-Boy model came from Robco. The Securitrons, Protectrons, Sentry bots patrolling the streets, all Robco designs. When you needed a robot to replace the human worker you just fired, you called Robco. When the government needed weapons systems, same company. West-Tec took a different approach. They focused on making humans obsolete in warfare itself. Their advanced weapons division created power armor that turned individual soldiers into walking tanks. Their biomedical sciences division developed the forced evolutionary virus, originally meant as a pan-immunity virion to counter Chinese biological weapons. That worked out great, as anyone who's encountered a super mutant can tell you. Then there's Nuka-Cola. Yes, the soda company. Released in 2044, it became so ubiquitous within a year that you couldn't walk down any American street without seeing the logo. They didn't just dominate the beverage market, they consumed it. Couldn't buy out a competitor? Fine, release Nuka Cherry, Nuka-Cola Quantum, Nuka Grape, and bury them through sheer variety. By 2050, they'd open Nuka World, an entire theme park dedicated to carbonated drinks. In a country where food shortages were causing riots, a soda company was building amusement parks. The domestic situation was already critical before China invaded Alaska. Food shortages triggered riots across the nation in August. Not protests, riots. People weren't marching with signs asking for change. They were fighting for survival. The government's response was predictable. Martial law, democracy officially became dictatorship, and nobody seemed particularly surprised. Appalachia got hit worst. Hornwright Industrial Mining Company, Atomic Mining Services, and Robco Industries decided human labor was inefficient. Governor Evans agreed. Thousands of workers found themselves jobless, unable to feed their families, watching robots do the jobs that used to keep them alive. The Wartime Workers Act made it worse, criminalizing labor organizing while companies automated everything in sight. The Appalachian mining riots of late 2077 weren't strikes. They were battles, workers fighting corporate enforcers and government troops in regular combat. This wasn't happening in some distant country. This was American citizens at war with their own government in their own backyard because corporations wanted better profit margins. And while workers starved, the surveillance state expanded. The Navy facility at Sugar Grove wasn't monitoring foreign threats. They were watching American citizens, identifying labor activists, and anyone else deemed a traitor. The usual outcome? Abduction. Murder without trial. If you had kids, they'd be adopted by loyalist families who'd raise them properly. No trials, no due process, just disappearances that nobody talked about. Meanwhile, taxes hit record highs to fund a war with no end in sight. Government officials were quietly evacuating to remote locations, preparing for the inevitable. The president wasn't even in the country. He was on an oil rig with the inner circle that would become the enclave. America was leaderless while its people rioted in the streets. China was desperate. That's the part people forget. In December 2066, they invaded Alaska because America had declared it wouldn't trade fossil fuels with anyone. China's entire economy ran on oil they no longer had access to. So they decided to take it by force, seizing Alaska's pipeline, derricks, and reserves. The Anchorage front line turned into a meat grinder that would drag on for years. The United States responded by annexing Canada. Not asking, not negotiating, annexing. Military occupation, resource exploitation. Canada became strategic territory, and Canadians became subjects whether they liked it or not. Over 5 years, the United States stripped its northern neighbor for parts while fighting China in Alaska. Then, in 2074, America opened a second front by invading mainland China. The strategy was destabilization. Force China to fight on multiple fronts, stretch their resources until something broke. But American supply lines were just as stretched. The mainland was hostile territory where every advantage disappeared into adverse conditions and logistics nightmares. What turned the tide was technology. The T-45 power armor deployed in January 2067 gave American troops the ability to wield heavy weapons with enhanced mobility. China scrambled to develop counters but couldn't match the engineering. Then came the T-51 in 2074, superior in every way. Chinese forces started crumbling. Resources from annexed nations couldn't keep pace with battlefield losses. But wars aren't won by technology alone. They're won by will. And by 2077, nobody had any left. October 23rd, 2077 started like any other Saturday. At 3:37 a.m., bombers appeared at high altitude. 3 hours earlier, Suspicious submarines had been spotted off the California coast. But most people ignored the signs. They'd been living under nuclear threat for so long that warnings had become background noise. At 9:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System detected incoming missiles. Nobody knew where they came from. China was the obvious suspect, but in those final moments, it didn't matter. At 9:26 a.m., 13 minutes later, the United States ordered a retaliatory strike under Scenario MX-CN91. Mutually assured destruction wasn't a deterrent anymore. It was the plan. The world ended in 2 hours. Think about that. 2 hours to erase everything humanity had built over millennia. 2 hours to reduce cities to ash, to poison the atmosphere, to kill billions of people. The Great War wasn't a war. It was synchronized suicide on a global scale. Most assigned vault dwellers never made it to their vaults. Some thought the sirens were another drill. They'd heard so many false alarms that the real thing sounded exactly the same. By the time they realized this wasn't practice, the bombs were already falling. Others ran, but didn't make it in time. The lucky ones died in the initial blasts. The unlucky ones died slowly from radiation poisoning in the days and weeks that followed. The National Guard was useless. Electromagnetic pulses disabled their communications and equipment the moment the first warheads detonated. No coordination, no command structure. Just individual units watching the sky light up with nuclear fire while their radios screamed static. Here's what nobody understood until it was too late. The American government had already abandoned the country. The president was on an oil rig with the Enclave. Key officials had evacuated to bunkers weeks earlier. When the missiles launched, there was no command and control structure remaining to organize any response or recovery. The continuity of government protocols had been corrupted by the Enclave's interference, creating a breakdown in the chain of command that guaranteed total collapse. America died leaderless. The military corporate oligarchs who'd spent decades consolidating power saved themselves and left everyone else to burn. 400 million citizens, most of them dead within hours. The rest facing a world transformed into something unrecognizable. The fallout killed more people than the initial blasts. Radiation poisoned water supplies, contaminated food, turned rain into acid that stripped skin from bone. The climate collapsed. Nuclear winter blocked out the sun. Temperatures plummeted. Crops failed globally. Starvation became universal. But that's not what killed civilization. Civilization died because there was nothing left to organize around. The government was gone. The military had fractured into disconnected units. Supply chains had vaporized. Currency was worthless. Laws were meaningless. Every institution that held society together had either been destroyed or had abandoned its responsibilities. The corporations that had profited from the resource wars were gone too. Vault-Tec's executives were sealed in their own vaults, running experiments on the people who'd paid for safety. West-Tech's facilities were craters. Robco's robots wandered aimlessly without functioning control systems. Nuka-Cola's theme park became a radioactive tomb. The hyper-capitalist machine that had consumed pre-war America ground to a halt when there was nobody left to exploit. The United States, as it had existed, ceased to be. Not just the government or the economy. The entire concept. The principles of liberty and justice that the nation had supposedly been founded on had been abandoned long before the bombs fell, traded away piece by piece for security that never came. What died on October 23rd wasn't just a country. It was the last pretense that any of those ideals had mattered. Survivors began rebuilding immediately because they had no choice. But they weren't rebuilding America. They were building something entirely new from the radioactive ruins of what had been destroyed. Small communities formed around water sources, defensible positions, salvageable resources. These weren't governed by democratic principles or corporate interests. They were governed by survival. The Fallout universe isn't a warning about nuclear war. It's a warning about what happens when you sacrifice everything that matters for the illusion of security. Pre-war America didn't fall because of external enemies. It collapsed because it hollowed itself out from the inside, replacing democracy with corporate oligarchy, trading civil rights for temporary safety, automating away human dignity in pursuit of profit margins. The bombs just revealed what had already been lost. When you boot up Fallout and see that cheerful Vault Boy giving his thumbs up, remember he's smiling at the end result of a society that chose capitalism over humanity, security over freedom, and survival of the richest over survival of the species. The real apocalypse happened in boardrooms and Senate chambers decades before anyone pushed the button.